We want to turn to 1 Kings chapter 4 tonight. And we're going to continue our study of Solomon. We were doing this through Bible Bold with David, and it was requested we just go ahead and continue with Solomon. Tonight, we will learn something of the magnificent excess of Solomon. 1 Kings chapter 4. Solomon began that reign. It was quite bloody, having to do away with his enemies one by one. We read about 3 of them that were killed and 1 of them that was banished. And then we can begin to read something about his, I call it his magnificent excess, when he offered those sacrifices down at Gilgal. And there he made that, had that dream and asked for that wisdom from God, which God granted him wisdom and also riches and a long life in a great kingdom. We'll see something of that tonight. I'm going to be reading a lot of names tonight at the beginning. We'll kind of stumble through those. We're going to read about the princes and officers of Solomon, the extent of his kingdom, his daily provisions, and his largeness of heart and what that might mean. And so, you might want to follow with me. 1 Kings chapter 4, his princes and officers. So King Solomon was king over all Israel, and these were the princes which he had. Now let me read this out of my Bible that's got some pronunciation helps here. It says, Azariah, the son of Zadok, the priest, Elihoreph and Ahiah, the sons of Sisha, scribes, Jehoshaphat, the son of Abilud, the recorder, and Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, over the host, and Zadok and Abiathar were the priests. And Azariah, the son of Nathan, was over the officers, and Zabud, the son of Nathan, was principal officer, and the king's friend. And Ahishar was over the household, and Adoniram, the son of Abda, was over the tribute. The king's friend. Well, that would be the king's confidant, the king's counselor, someone that was an advisor that would be very close to King Solomon as he reigned. Now let's look at some of those officers. Solomon had 12 officers over all Israel, which provided victuals for the king and his household, each man his month, in a year made provision. That word, victuals, when I look at that, I wouldn't have pronounced it that way. I've heard it pronounced victuals, and I've heard it pronounced victuals. It's spelled like victuals, but the correct pronunciation is victuals. And I was kind of glad to hear that, because I've heard of victuals all my life and never really understood what victuals were. And it's a strange word. This is really a Bible lesson here, but English words have some strange histories. And this is one case in the English language where the pronunciation was one way, but the spelling came another way. The pronunciation came from the Saxons and the spelling came from the French. There's a French word very similar to this. And when they began to write the English language, they wrote it with the French way of transporting from the French into the English. It comes out looking like victuals, but it never caught on, and everyone continued to pronounce it victuals. And so the correct pronunciation, when you're reading the Bible and you come across that word, you can just go ahead and say victuals, and know that you are highly educated and aware of the history of that word and how it comes into the English language. Of course, I would call it maybe the modern speech version to simplify this. Let's say it's the culinary provisions. So we're talking about the food that he had, and we'll read a little bit more of that here as we get into it. But these were the 12 officers that provided that, beginning in verse 8. And these are their names, the son of Hur and Mount Ephraim. You might remember Hur. Aaron and Hur were the ones that upheld the arms of Moses when they were in the wilderness, when they were attacked by the Amalekites. And so by the son of her, some descendant of her now that is this officer here. And then we read the son of Dekar and Maskaz and Sheabim and Bethshemesh and Elon Beth-Hanan, the son of Hesed and Araboth. To him pertaineth Succoth and all the land of Hepher. And it seems like these officers are being identified not by their personal names, but by their heritage and from the lands from which they came. Now look what we see in verse 11. The son of Abinadab in all the reigns of Dor, which had Tapheth, the daughter of Solomon, to wife. Did you know that Solomon had a daughter? We know his son, Rehoboam, and he was not a wise son. He became king, but he had other children. And here we read about a daughter that he had. And so he's got his son-in-law here involved in this. Going on reading, we got Baanan, the son of Ahilud. To him pertaineth the Tekanach and Megiddo and Beth-shean, which is by Zartanah beneath Jezreel, from Bethshean to Abel Meholab, even unto the place that is beyond Jokneam. Verse 13. The son of Ger in Ramoth Gilead. To him pertaineth the towns of Jair, the son of Manasseh, which are in Gilead. To him also pertaineth the region of Argob, which is in Bashan. 80 great cities with walls and brazen bars. And Ahinadab, the son of Iddo, had Mahanaim, and Ahimazah was in Naphtali. He also took Besmath, the daughter of Solomon, to wife. 2 of Solomon's daughters mentioned here in this chapter. And then we have in verse 16, Baanan, the son of Hushai, was in Asher in Aloth. Now we're not quite through. Verse 17, Jehoshaphat, the son of Paruah in Issachar, Shimei, the son of Elah in Benjamin, Geber, the son of Uri, was in the country of Gilead, in the country of Sihon, king of the Amorites, and of Og, king of Bashan, and he was the only officer that was in the land. You might remember back in your old Bible history about Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan. These were 2 mighty kings over mighty peoples that appeared when Moses came and led the children of Israel up to the Jordan River. And they wanted to attack those Israelites, but at the same time, the Israelites wanted their land. And so the tribes on that side of the river went up in battle against those kings, and Moses actually led the battle against those kings, and they defeated them. And then 3 of the tribes, or 2 tribes, and the half tribe of Manasseh, liked the area so much they wanted to settle on that side of the Jordan instead of crossing the Jordan and going on and taking the other land. Moses said, you can do that if you'll go fight with us to obtain the rest of the land, and then when it is ours you can return to this and settle your tribes there. And that's what they did. But they must have been mighty kings to have been remembered so long after this time that the area is still identified by the names of those kings. Now, going from the princes and officers, let's go to the extent of Solomon's reign. Judah and Israel were many, as the sand which is by the sea in multitude, eating and drinking and making merry It was a large body of people now that this nation of Israel had become. And God had promised Abraham that their seed would be as the stars of heaven, as the dust of the earth, and as the sand which is by the sea. And so we see that has come to pass now in the reign of Solomon, with a multitude of the Israelites, and they're happy, and they're contented, and they're prosperous in their reign. In verse 21, Solomon reigned over all the kingdom from the river, now that would be the river Euphrates, from the river unto the land of the Philistines and unto the border of Egypt. They brought presents and served Solomon all the days of his life. That was the great land that God had promised to Abraham, and the land that it is said was given to them under the reign of, when Joshua led the children, he said, there failed not all of anything that God had promised them, all came to pass. We read how that David led those Israelites in recovering the land, and now Solomon reigning over that land from the Euphrates River all the way to the border of Egypt. So let's look at Solomon's daily provisions. And here we begin to see some of his extravagance. Solomon's provisions for one day. Now, this would not be for Solomon himself, but for Solomon and all his princes and officers and their families and those over whom they had controlled. And this is to feed all of the government workers under Solomon in his reign. The people would supply this to Solomon. And here's what it says they would supply in one day: 30 measures of fine flour, and 80 measures of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 oxen out of the pastures, and 100 sheep, beside harts and roebucks and fallow deer and fatted fowl. For he had dominion over all the region on this side of the river, from Tipsah even to Azah, over all the kings on this side of the river, and he had peace on all sides round about him. And Judah and Israel dwelt safely, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, from Dan even to Beersheba, or Beersheba. Well, two expressions there. Every man under his vine and every man under his fig tree. Everyone was happy in their own little home with their own little provisions and their own little household, and that became sort of a proverb or a saying, every man under his vine and under his fig tree. And then from Dan to Beersheba, and if you'll remember that map of Israel, you may want to look in the back, Dan to that city to the far north, and Beersheba, the city to the far south, in that main portion of Israel, and covering all of the land from north to south. And so those expressions found here. And they did that all the days of Solomon. So Solomon did have a long and good and peaceful and prosperous reign, with all his enemies round about at peace with him. Verse 26. Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots, and 12,000 horsemen. 40,000 stalls. Now that's mind-boggling, isn't it? 40,000. I read some of these numbers in the Old Testament and I wonder, what am I reading here? Are these numbers real? Is this exaggerated? Do we interpret these numbers correctly? And I don't have all the answers for that. But I want you to notice something about these 40,000 stalls and 12,000 horsemen. We read about that again in 1 Chronicles 9 in verse 25. But it doesn't say 40,000. It said Solomon had 4,000 stalls for horses and chariots, and again 12,000 horsemen. It's a little easier for me to comprehend 4,000 stalls than it is 40,000. But go on and read, and we find some other things. 1 Kings 10 and verse 26, Solomon had 1,400 chariots. Now, it doesn't say he had 40,000 horses. It doesn't say he had 4,000 horses. It said he had 4,000 stalls. And then it talks about his chariots, 1,400 chariots. Well, it's interesting to me that all those numbers have the 4 and the 1,000 in them. I'm beginning to think I can understand 1,400 chariots. That's getting into the realm of comprehension. That's repeated again in 2 Chronicles 1 and verse 14. Solomon had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen. Now you might want to notice in each one of those verses, the number of horsemen stayed the same. 12,000 horsemen. You know, 12 is a number that's kind of a symbolic number a lot of the times in the Bible. 12 tribes of Israel, and you read about 12 several times. But now here you've got 12,000 horsemen, 1,400 chariots, and either 4,000 or this bigger number, 40,000 stalls. Now, I may not be able to figure all these numbers out, but I'll tell you, Solomon had quite infantry and military then with that many chariots and that many horsemen, and then the horses enough to take care of them and the stalls enough for the horses. That's what we'll get out of this. I find it interesting that in the Septuagint translation, now that's the translation that was between the Testaments, where the Jews had gone into Alexandria, Egypt, and they translated out of the Hebrew into the Greek, and those Hebrew manuscripts that the Jews translated out of are lost. But we do have the Septuagint translation of them. And as I was studying this and trying to pull all these numbers together, in the Septuagint translation of 1 Kings 4 and verse 26, it said Solomon had 4,000 stalls, not the 40,000. But in the old Hebrew text that we do have of that passage, it is 40,000. Well, what do you make of this? I don't know just how all the Hebrew numbers came to being, how they were copying this, whether the person explaining this or reading the text as they were copying it down mispronounced or something. Somehow there's a 40,000 got in there and a 4,000 got in there, and they have known of this for all these many years, and yet in faithfulness they keep copying it the same way, because they want to make sure we have accurate copies. If there was an error, it was long ago in some of the copying. When people talk about the errors and discrepancies in the Bible, I want you to remember, this is the kind of thing they talk about. And what is the big significance now between 40,000 stalls and 4,000? In the scheme of things in the Bible, it reduces to something infinitesimal. And rather than that causing me to doubt or wonder about the Scriptures, I'm impressed with how carefully they keep copying these things. And then where the errors and apparent difficulties, and there may be some explanation we don't know about, but it looks like an apparent difficulty shows up, it's so insignificant. And so for me, that just reinforces my confidence in the books that we have, rather than detracting from them. But I thought that was interesting, that 40,000 stalls. Now, Solomon's largeness of heart. I'll show you how you can take an expression like that, and you might think, well, largeness of heart, that could mean a lot of things. Is he a good giver? Is he of great compassion? Or what does that mean? Well, we'll look at it in context. And when you see expressions like that and put them in their context, it helps you maybe understand what we're talking about. God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding exceeding much, and largeness of heart, even as the sand that is on the seashore. And Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the children of the east country, and all the wisdom of Egypt, for he was wiser than all men, than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman, and Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol, and his fame was in all nations round about. I don't know who these men were, Ethan, Heman, Calcol, Darda, and Mahol, but evidently they were considered wise men. And those in those days, when they were reading this, would recognize, now those are men of great wisdom, and would be impressed that Solomon's wisdom exceeded the wisdom of them all. What does it mean, his largeness of heart? Let's keep reading. He spake 3,000 proverbs, and his songs was 1,005. And he spake of trees, from the cedar tree that is in Lebanon, even to the hyssop that springeth out of the wall. He spake also of beasts and fowl and creeping things, and of fishes. And there came of all people to hear the wisdom of Solomon, from all the kings of the earth, which had heard of his wisdom. Now, what are we talking about, largeness of heart? Well, let these verses in this context explain it. Solomon had a broad interest in many things, and he studied many things out. He was a gatherer of proverbs and would speak the proverbs, and a writer of songs. And he studied all these plants and animals. And looking at this and thinking of those proverbs, it says that Solomon spake 3,000 proverbs. There we have a book of Proverbs, the Proverbs of Solomon. There's not 3,000 in there. I was got to wondering how many proverbs are in the book of Proverbs. Well, you can Google that, okay? So you just kind of get on the computer, how many proverbs in the book of Proverbs? You'll get all kind of answers in a broad range of numbers. And I thought, how did they come up with such different numbers? So I did this in getting ready for this sermon. I sat down and read the book of Proverbs and counted them. And here's why you can't get a good count of the number of Proverbs. It depends on what you count. Now, there's some chapters this is easy. You'll go through the book of Proverbs, and in every verse is kind of a standalone proverb. And when you get through the end of the chapter, you look at the number of verses, and you know what that, however many verses were, that's how many proverbs there were in that chapter. But every chapter is not so easy. Some of these proverbs bleed out over 3 or 4 verses, and they're kind of extended proverbs. And there's proverbs within those proverbs. It depends on how you're going to slice them and count them and say, now, do I count this one as 4 proverbs, or is this one extended proverb? And some of these are entire chapters that tell a lesson. Will that be counted as a proverb, that whole chapter? Are there 2 proverbs in that chapter? Or 2 sayings in that we would remember? And so it kind of depends on how you define proverbs and how you apply that application going through. Nevertheless, I said, well, I'll define it my way, and every time I think I see a proverb, I will count. Now, according to my count, I counted 600 proverbs in the book of Proverbs. You don't think that's right? Okay, count them. Count them. And it's not as hard to do as you might think. The Proverbs contain 31 chapters. My son-in-law, Justin, was telling me that for about 4 years, he has gotten up every morning and read one chapter of the book of Proverbs, so that he reads the entire book of Proverbs through every month. And it doesn't take long to read one of the chapters in the book of Proverbs. Now, you might just try doing that. What a good way to start the day. Read, and I know that some of the months just have 30 days, and one of them just has 20. Well, you know how many months have 29 days? They all do. Okay, but some of them have just 29 days. But if you'll do, and you can just read a double up on that time. But you can read the book of Proverbs through in a month, and my good son-in-law has done that for about 4 years, and it's not that hard to read. You can read them pretty quick. And so I would just challenge you to do it. And that'd be an interesting way to read the Proverbs. Just take something and read the chapter. And as you're reading, maybe just kind of take the slash count. Okay, there's a proverb. And count them by chapter and add them together. And you'll get confused before you get through. That's why I say about 600. It's going to depend on how you count them. But 600... And Solomon spake 3,000. Well, we just have a portion of the Proverbs that Solomon collected, don't we? And then we read how that he spake of trees, from the cedar tree that's in Lebanon, even to the hyssop that springeth out of the wall. He spake also of beast and fowl and creeping things and of fishes. He was interested in the plants and in the animals. See if I can find this right quick. In the Song of Solomon. Go through and read the Song of Solomon and count how many plants are mentioned in the Song of Solomon. I did that and I came up with 23 plants. How many animals are mentioned in the Song of Solomon? I counted 14 different animals. Well, Solomon was familiar with this, and he was interested in the botany and the zoology that was available to him. And so he studied all these plants and animals and wrote songs. What was it? How many songs? 1,005 songs. And out of 1,005 songs, the Song of Songs which he wrote is the Song of Solomon. The only song from him that we have. Except perhaps one of the Psalms are attributed to Solomon, and I forgot to look that up and jot that down. But all that work, this one is saved in the Song of Solomon. I don't know if we'll be able to get into the Song of Solomon or not in this study we're doing of Solomon, but it's the most baffling book in the Bible. And you wonder, what are we talking about when we read that book? And there's generally two interpretations. One of it is Solomon's love for the Shulamite and the Shulamite's love for him. And it's like they're sending love notes back and forth to each other. But there's another one that you'll find in the old Dixon Bible. And that is the love of Solomon for the Shulamite and the love of the Shulamite for her shepherd back home. And so it's kind of a love triangle. Solomon's trying to woo the Shulamite, and the Shulamite holds on to her love for the shepherd. If that's the case, the Song of Solomon is Solomon singing the blues about a love he was not able to have. And yet there's other interpretations of the book. Maybe we'll get into the book of Song of Solomon later, but it's interesting. And then it talks about all his wisdom that the Lord gave him and how people came from all the earth to hear his wisdom. We have a book of his wisdom in the book of Ecclesiastes. And here Solomon is an old man, and it's like he's the old man invited to speak at the youth rally. He's talking to the young people. And he says, young people, I've tried this. I applied my heart to know and to understand all things. And like this, he goes through all these things. He tried to study and learn and find where is the satisfaction and purpose and meaning of life. Well, it's like chasing after the wind. I didn't find it in anything under the sun. But I know where you find it. You fear God and keep His commandments. It's a shame that Solomon went so far out and got so lost in so many worldly things and forgot that lesson that David taught him, to show thyself a man and to keep the statutes and the commandments and the ordinances and the judgments of God. But that wise man, like a fool, thought he had to find out for himself. And he did. And it was vexation of spirit. And he came back and essentially told those young people, you know, I should have listened to my daddy. And you need to listen to me. And that is fear God and keep His commandments. Now that gets us to the end of this chapter on Solomon. In the book of Kings, it's produced very early, telling us the story of his reign, so we might have some understanding of its excessive magnificence that he had. And we'll kind of keep that in mind then as we go on through this book. I'm reminded, though, of what we read in the New Testament, where Jesus says, behold, a greater than Solomon is here. Oh, Solomon, the wisdom, the learning, the riches, the power, a long reign. And yet this lowly man of Nazareth was able to say, greater than Solomon is here. Jesus was not greater than Solomon in worldly things, but in spiritual things. The kingdom Jesus would give us would not be just another worldly kingdom. They would excel in riches and tenure than the other kingdoms of this world. No, it'd be a spiritual kingdom. They would exceed in riches all the riches of the world. And it would because it would be spiritual riches that endure rather than temporal riches that go away. It would extend in length to the end of time. And then he would turn it over to his Father, where that kingdom would be brought then into eternity. No greater king and no greater kingdom than that of our Lord. And when we read all of this magnificence of Solomon, we want to be humbled. It was all magnificent and things under the sun. And now we are heirs of spiritual things which are greater than all of these. And we're in that eternal kingdom. And the Bible promises us that we are joint heirs with Christ, and we will share in His glory. And that just boggles my mind. Oh yeah, Solomon, he had a lot going for him, but I'll tell you, none of us would want to trade places in the spiritual blessings we have. All the material greatness of Solomon, we wouldn't trade it at all, because what we have is greater than what he had. I'm going to invite you tonight to be part of that kingdom and to be heirs of those spiritual blessings. If you haven't been baptized into Christ, they're not yours, because all these spiritual blessings are in heavenly places in Christ. And so I'll invite you to come forward. We can take your confession where you confess your faith before men, and we'll baptize you into Christ this night as we stand and sing the invitation song.